Alright, welcome to my next video. Today I'll be talking about a new form of carbon capture, which of course is a technology that allows you to pull CO2 from the air in an effort to prevent global warming. I'll go over a bit about what global warming is, why it's so bad, then what the current technology for carbon capture is, as well as the new technology which really attempts to solve a lot of the problems that the current technology has. So, a bit about global warming. The main cause of global warming, from a science point of view, is something called the greenhouse effect, where light from the sun, comes to the Earth through the atmosphere, hits the ground, and bounces off. Some of it's absorbed by the ground, some of it bounces off into space, and then some is absorbed by the atmosphere. The issue with the greenhouse effect is that the air in the atmosphere is able to absorb more sunlight than it's supposed to, and it traps the heat, basically raising the temperature of the globe. And this actually is a good effect to some degree. Of course, the Earth would be a lot colder if it didn't happen at all, but the issue really comes when an excessive amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are present in the atmosphere, and the Earth starts heating up to dangerous levels for humans and other life on the planet. And of course, CO2 is the greenhouse gas we hear the most about, and it's the one that we're producing arguably the most of. But it actually isn't the worst. There's a lot that have much greater greenhouse effect, but CO2 is really the big issue, since we're producing so much of it by burning fossil fuels, coal and oil, and also through various industrial production. And this paper will mostly focus on directly capturing carbon that's coming from coal power plants. So we'll talk a little bit about why that would be beneficial. So there's a lot of science around the way that carbon dioxide enters and leaves the atmosphere, and it's sort of part of a larger cycle called the carbon cycle. Of course, CO2, is carbon dioxide, and it really just is one of the forms that carbon takes through this cycle. Some of the other forms are, sugars or hydrocarbons, fuel, and as well as, many other things. Life is really made of carbon. And that's actually a lot of what mediates this cycle is life. You see the photosynthesis takes carbon from the atmosphere, puts it into plants. Animals eat the plants, or plants die, and the carbon returns to the ground or to the atmosphere, partly through decay, partly through respiration, where basically animals using up the energy that carbon has, and really in the same way that we burn fossil fuels, we consume carbon-containing things and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And after photosynthesis occurs, the carbon is then put into a solid form, which plants eventually use up the energy that they store with photosynthesis, or animals eat the plants, or, just animals and plants die and sort of decay and turn into fossils. And a lot of these things store carbon in the earth, sort of sequestered, you could say, into the earth and the water. And the reason that, humans are causing more climate change than normal is that we're pulling the CO2 that's in these fossils, pulling it out of the earth, burning it, or using it for other things, and putting a huge amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, much more than the plants are able to pull back out. And this obviously is not a good thing, and there's a lot of different solutions for global warming, and the most obvious one is just to use less carbon, put less carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But it's kind of a controversial topic, and really the issue is that you can't just stop using coal and oil all at once. So it's something you have to do very gradually. But it's much more urgent of an issue. A short-term solution, of course, is to use carbon capture, which, instead of getting rid of the carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, you take more out of it, sort of help the plants get rid of some of the carbon dioxide, and basically a human-made way of undoing some of the damage that we've done by putting so much carbon dioxide into the air. So getting into the current technology that we have for it, there's a series of chemical reactions here that use something called an amine, which is the top left corner you see, that is basically just a nitrogen-containing compound that combines with CO2 to form a series of other compounds that, allows you to take the CO2 out of the air, put it into these compounds, and then eventually do something with it. And it basically works by, running a lot of polluted air through a filter that contains these chemicals. Then that absorbs it, the other air passes through, you take the carbon dioxide out. But there's a lot of issues with this process, and sort of get into those issues and see that this new technology attempts to solve a lot of those problems by using a different chemical. So this reaction essentially proceeds by the CO2 reacting with the nitrogen, and there's a couple of different results that you can get, and I won't go into too much detail, this probably looks a bit confusing, but the main takeaway is that you either get something called carbamic acid or carbamate, which are essentially the same thing. The CO2 gets stuck to the nitrogen, and it's really hard to take off of it. Or you get a situation where you form bicarbonate, where the CO2 and the nitrogen sort of become magnetically attached to each other, which is easier to pull apart, but is only one of the three possible outcomes. This causes, of course, an issue of trying to reuse the filters, because you want to be able to process a lot of CO2, and if you can only use it once and it forms a stable compound, you can't really reuse it. So recycling these amines takes a lot of energy, and it's not a very efficient process. And in addition to being inefficient, it also isn't very selective. So that basically means when you're running air through it, there's a lot of different things in air apart from carbon dioxide. A lot of oxygen, a lot of nitrogen, and it's actually the oxygen that also reacts with these amines. Basically causes them to absorb a lot of oxygen along with the CO2, which means you can only really effectively filter air containing a lot of CO2, because otherwise you'll just basically waste the filter, just picking up a lot of oxygen, not really getting a good yield of CO2. And one of the issues that these amines have is that they're quite toxic. So in order to use them safely, you have to dilute them with a lot of water. So what ends up happening is that these filters contain a lot of water with a small amount of amines in them. So you can't really be that efficient in terms of the amount of liquid that you have. So all of these issues are actually addressed by this new technology. You can see that it uses something called a Cyclodextrin metal organic framework, which is, a lot of words, but sort of breaking it down, the cyclodextrin refers to this circular sugar that you see, which is made up of these repeating units of sugars, which obviously are pretty non-toxic. We eat sugar all the time, but this sort of allows you to make a kind of a unreactive, pretty stable framework. You see on the left that it's formed into this sort of grid with a lot of pockets in it. The really dark black molecules are actually metals that they then place onto the sugar framework, forming the metal organic framework. This allows you to sort of lock these metals in place, and the metals are actually what is going to react with the CO2, whereas the sugar just sort of allows it to be stable and to separate the metals so they stay very reactive. However, even though the sugar is ideally pretty unreactive, there's some possibility that that's actually the thing that is capturing the carbon. So throughout the study, they sort of do a few different experiments to eliminate the possibility that it is the sugar that's reacting. You've seen these first two reactions. You start with the red OH, which is basically the reactive group of the sugars, and then the blue CO2 comes along and attaches to it. And while this would be effective for capturing carbon, it sort of runs into the same issue that the nitrogen has, where once it's stuck to that oxygen, it doesn't really want to leave, and it would be very hard to recycle it. And the third reaction here, which they actually prove is the one that's happening, the carbon dioxide reacts with the OH that's not attached to the rest of the molecule. It's sort of attached to the metal, and then that forms sort of a separate molecule, and it's sort of just like magnetically attached to the metal, which becomes very easy to remove. You still have to use heat, but much less heat, and it becomes a very efficient process. So, I've shown that they solve the toxicity issue by using just sugars as the framework. They've also gotten rid of the sort of irreversible reactions. And, of course, the last issue they have to work with is the selectivity of it, to see if it absorbs other things from air. You see this, the first part of this figure, it shows a graph of the CO2 absorbed over a certain amount of time. Of course, it just goes up quickly and then levels out. But, you see it's supposed to be 3 different lines, but it's actually so selective that it only has the single line, where the blue is supposed to be untreated, purple is supposed to be after being exposed to nitrogen, and red is exposed to air, which is oxygen and nitrogen, where basically shows that it has no effect. It only absorbs the CO2. It's not absorbing the nitrogen or other things. Whereas, if you ran the same test with the amines, it'd probably be fine with nitrogen, but the air, all the oxygen would just ruin the ability to absorb CO2. It's a very good result. It basically shows it has no issue with absorbing other things. The last part of the figure sort of reiterates that it's very easy to recycle it. It's showing the number of cycles of absorbing CO2 and then removing the CO2 and trying to absorb it again. And it shows a very minor increase, maybe like 5% decrease in the amount of CO2 that it can absorb over the many recyclings, which means it'll basically be a very long-lasting filter. And so, this probably won't be, the best possible way of absorbing CO2, but it seems to be a pretty big improvement from the previous technologies. And as far as I know, it also has a pretty low cost, pretty safe to use, and yeah, it just seems like a pretty good product. Of course, carbon capture is only one of many solutions for global warming, and we sort of need to implement multiple things to really solve the problems that it's causing. But anyway, thanks for watching. Hopefully you found this interesting, and I guess like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you later.